Warm welcome this evening to my talk on Beatrix Potter. Uh, I know a lot of you certainly will be familiar with some of her charming little books, which actually stray outside of the period of the Victorian era, but it all starts in 1866 with her birth. And so I'm going to just take you through some notable points of this remarkable woman's life. We'll have a look at some of her charming illustrations and some of the art that you may be less familiar with. I'd like to thank particularly the excellent book. If you're looking for a book on Beatrix Potter, you could do no worse than Linda Lear's book, published in 2007, A Life in Nature, and I heartily recommend it. I'm also very thankful to the Victoria and Albert Museum's archive, photographic archive, Tate Britain. And I was fortunate enough last year to visit the Burnham Institute, which has a wonderful little exhibition of Beatrix Potter's work and some of her watercolours. As ever, I look at Christie's and Sotheby's, the Eastwick Country House, managed by National Trust, the World of Beatrix Potter, which is in Gloucester, notably, near the shop for the Nine Tailors of Gloucester, National Trust in Coniston, Cumbria, National Portrait Gallery, Perth Art Gallery and Perth Museum, and the Dunkeld Community Archive, the Armet Museum in Ambleside, and also Clarence and Edmund Fry and Son Photography. So I've got the thanks out the way, and really I couldn't do this talk without some of these pictorial archives that have been so helpful. So it's an enormous industry, and it's an amazing thing that now she died in 1943. Her fame has just really grown throughout the last century. And she's really as much loved by children now as she ever was when she first made these wonderful illustrated books. And that's what she's known for. And these characters. And there's still these shops, particularly there's one in Gloucester. There's obviously one in the Lake District. And there are several throughout the country which have these merchandise. And it's an enormous industry, really. But that was all part of her work. And she supervised quite a bit of some of the earlier iterations of the games and mazes and pictures herself. She was a remarkable woman. It was quite good to go to the Beatrix Potter Garden in Burnham in Perthshire. Came across it actually quite unexpectedly while I was doing some research for Millay, and it was good to go there. And they had a map of a number of the houses that her and her family had rented up in Perthshire, and so it was a great help to me to look at that and to just visit some of the places. And where possible, I've tried to use my photographs of some of the books. Now, the books that she's best known by are really this period of almost 30 years, and that's when her best known and best loved character books were published. I put that in chronological order. I do have a PDF of this if you would like to have a look at it. But obviously, some of the titles are ones that are well known, particularly Peter Rabbit, Tailor Squirrel Nutkin, The Tailor of Gloucester, of course, is a very popular one. But there are plenty of other ones. Tale of the Flopsy Bunnies, Tale of Ginger and Pickles. Mrs. Tittlemouse, Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. We've got all of these ones, which are part of so many of our childhood, particularly in Britain. We had our parents would read and let us look at these charming illustrations, and really they connect so well with childhood. So we're going to move on one. Now, where was she born? Well, her family came to London, and they lived in 2 Bolton Gardens in Kensington, really only a stone's throw away from what is now the Victoria and Albert Museum. And there's a photograph of it in the lower right-hand pane there. And unfortunately, this house no longer stands, but the site is marked on the wall in the road there, and that is the sign up in the top right-hand corner, and it commemorates the fact that Beatrix Potter lived there. And as a young woman, she spent time in the collections, and certainly the costume collection, what became the Victoria and Albert Museum, was an enormous part of her work, really. And you will often notice these wonderful textiles and clothes that many of her characters wear or adapted. And that was as a result of her consulting the costume collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum. She's also lived pretty near, those who know London or West London pretty well, and the area around Chelsea, they'll know the Brompton Cemetery in West London. And I would recommend it if you do come to England. Some of our great cemeteries of London are fascinating places. And in fact, if you were to go around the Brompton Cemetery, you will find certain gravestones, one to the Nutkins family, the McGregors, Peter Rabbit, Jeremiah Fisher. She possibly internalized some of those names from gravestones, and they ended up as characters in her book. She had a peculiar childhood in many ways. Some of it was, we gather from Linda Lear's book, not all of it was happy. She was a thoughtful young woman, and she certainly applied herself to the study of nature, particularly at first. Her father was Rupert Potter, who you may have remember I've talked about before, because he was a friend of John Everett Millais and was involved in photographing a lot of Millet's paintings. Millet himself lived in Kensington at the time, and then he moved to Palace Gate. And Potter, who was a barrister, was also a photographer. And there's the camera up in the top right-hand corner there. These enormous contraptions that Beatrix actually took some interest in photography herself. She had a brother called Bertram, or Bertie. And there she is with her brother and her father outside the house in Perthshire. And like so many Victorian families, the summer on into autumn was spent up in Tayside, particularly for the fishing and the hunting. And Beatrix Potter's father hosted many a shooting and fishing party of the great and the good of the Victorian era. And there are many photographs of notable politicians and artists who visited Dalgeese, particularly Lily Langtry. John Bright was a frequent visitor there, and many other Victorian politicians. Helen Leach Potter was her mother. She's often in the background of some of the photographs. The family itself come from Lancashire, although they rather buried their background in some ways when they came to London. But a lot of their money had come from the cotton industry, and particularly from the Glossop mills up in Lancashire. But they didn't forget their northern nonconformist roots. And certainly, even though Rupert, in his professional life, was very much London-based, the family still spoke in a strong Lancashire accent, and they often holidayed up in Cumbria, particularly, and they certainly favoured Scotland as one of the places that they would spend a lot of their holidays. And Beatrix and Walter Bertram were sort of like two peas in a pod, really. They were in touch throughout their life, and it was a close relationship. Both of them were somewhat protected from the outside world, or by their parents, and their parents also took a severe hand with any relationship that might be formed. And in fact, both of them experienced the downside of parental disapproval, of falling in love with the wrong person. So we come to a period, really, of the late 1870s and mid 1870s, one in which book illustration and watercolor painting was had really developed in such a way as to become highly influential upon the young Beatrix Potter. I would note illustrators of a similar period, slightly older, was Kate Greenaway with her charming little illustrations that I've put up in the top there. Miles Burkitt Foster also, his watercolours were a significant influence upon Beatrix. Randolph Caldecott, I'll show you some examples of his work. You can see that some of Caldecott's work was highly influential upon Beatrix's developing style. You can see here is a Randolph Caldecott illustration, A Farmer's Boy with Chickens and Ducks from 1881. I think you can see a little bit of Jemima Puddle Duck in some of those illustrations. Certainly in Randolph Caldecott's A Frog He Would a Wooing Go, after the famous song, certainly you can see something of Jeremy Fisher in Randolph Caldecott's work. And so it wasn't plagiarism, but certainly most artists borrow, and shall we say the greatest artists steal, as has been quoted. So as for art education, well, it was very much divided. A women's art education was different from a male art education. In fact, the Royal Academy was not to be part of what Beatrix experienced, but she spent time in the South Kensington Schools Museum, which is now the Victoria and Albert Museum. And of course, with a fine collection there, she was able to draw from the cast, and she took diplomas at the National Art Training School at Kensington Gore. There's a little plate there to give you an example of what a women's class was like in Beatrix's time and in her girlhood and young adolescence. So she spent a great deal of time painting and drawing. She had a governess as well, but she didn't go to a school as such. But she was largely educated at home. And she was an intelligent and a fast learner. If you've ever read one of her journals, which is written in a code, 1881 to 97, it's fascinating. So she was highly intelligent. This painting by Banner was painted from a photograph. It was painted later on in her life, although this depicts her as probably at about the age of 19. And she also was highly influenced, living around the corner from the Natural History Museum, by some of the wonderful work of Alfred Waterhouse. The designs for tiles and the fossils fascinated her. She even at times made these little bas reliefs, and I've got an example here from 1884 of a cat and a bowl of milk, and this is a bas relief. So she did work in 3D as well. She also painted examples from the museum, and and we know later on, Mary Anning, who was the great fossil hunter and paleontologist at Lyme Regis of a previous generation, she also visited Lyme Regis as well and was interested in what we call the Jurassic Coast. So there are all these influences, and certainly the world of natural history was very much available to her. And certainly at that time, the Natural History Museum, after its construction, had many examples of flora and fauna, and a lot of stuffed animals, of course. And but they made good models for her early work. She was, of course, in an era which was very highly influenced by the great art critic John Ruskin, who also shared the great love of the Lakeland as she did. And the quote from Ruskin is, "If you can paint one leaf, you can paint the world." And really, in a way, Beatrix Potter took this to heart, as you can see there, that wonderful little painting up in a corner there. She was influenced too by the art of the Renaissance, particularly Albrecht Dürer's wonderful studies, watercolor studies from nature. There's Dürer's study from 1502 of a hare. And look at some of her mycology illustrations. Her study of mushrooms and fungi were what she really cut her teeth on. And these are exceptionally well drawn and painted examples of her early work. And I've seen some of these, and they really are beautiful. They are almost pre-Raphaelite in their intensity and detail. And certainly, had Ruskin seen them, he would have approved of them. These are further examples of fungi painted in 1897. And you can see that she was they are scientific illustrations, but they do show great artistic prowess as well. Now, in a time each year, they would go up to Scotland, and in Perth, she came across a man here who was to play quite a significant part in her development, and it was a postman in Burnham, up near Dunkeld, called Charles Mackintosh. He is seen actually as the basis for Mr. McHenry as well. You can see in the illustration of there with Peter Rabbit, and you can see a likeness from the photograph. But he was an interesting, as so many naturalists were at the time, an amateur, but somebody who took his the interest in science very seriously. And his collection is and specimens are at Perth Museum, and that's his microscope there. I took those photographs of a cabinet of some of his work there. And so there was this good relationship between them. And as a result, she was able to develop her interest to something more than just a hobby, but it's something that would really be hopefully presented professional papers. And certainly Charles Mackintosh was a big help to the young Beatrice. There is a book, actually, a fascinating acquaintance, up in the top right-hand pane, a slide that I have here, and there's a book about that which you can read, and it's fascinating. And so much so, her work and her theories were brought together, and she wanted to present a paper to the Linnean Society at Burlington House. And her uncle, Henry Enfield Roscoe, who was professor of chemistry, tried to forward Beatrice's work to the Linnean Society. But being a stuffy Victorian society at the time, it did not admit papers from women, and therefore there was no way in. The Linnean Society have since apologised this in recent years, and now her work is recognised for what it is. There's a little photograph inside the Linnean Society. You can go there. There's actually a very interesting place to visit in London. It is open to the public. There's a room with paintings of Darwin and other notable natural scientists in the big room there, and papers and illustrations, and indeed some of these beautiful illustrations that Beatrix Potter did. But she was unsuccessful in many ways, or unrecognised, shall we say, in her early scientific work. Now, Victorian era is, of course, one where there was a great love of both field sports and of animals, and certainly by the mid 1860s, the idea that depicting animals was a lower form of art. It was once again seen as an important part of the Royal Academy summer exhibitions. That's a childhood drawing by Beatrix Potter on the left of a bear grabbing a roe deer. She would have seen many a dead deer in her father's shooting parties, so she probably drew that one from that. Henry Stacey Marks, in his wonderful paintings of birds, which appeared at the Royal Academy every summer exhibition, were also an influence. And he also exhibited at the Old Watercolour Society and the Fine Arts Society. And they always had this sort of human quality to these birds, and they are placed in interesting configurations. And no doubt they had some influence upon the young Beatrix Potter, as do Britton Riviere's Sympathy, following in the tradition really of Edwin Landseer as well, and the idea of the relationship between humans and animals was an important part of her own work, and that is a famous Victorian painting that many people would have known either through the actual painting or through photogravures and prints after it. So every August the family made its way up to Perthshire, and I was lucky to go through the station the other day. This is Dunkeld and Burnham Station, Perthshire, where they would arrive and then take the carriage to Dalgee's house, where they spent many a happy year or season, and it's also notable that this is the same station that John Everett Millais, the great Victorian painter, would get off at this particular station, and he would make his way to Mirthley or to St Mary's Tower in Burnham. And both Millais and Beatrix Potter knew one another, of course, through Rupert's photographic work. And so there was a whole, it was almost like the whole of one part of society moved up to Scotland during the shooting season, and were there up and out of town for a considerable period. And the station still retains some of its Victorian character. And it's a beautiful part of the world, and we see some of that in the background of Beatrix Potter's illustrations and paintings. And there was the Burnham Institute as well. And there's Beatrix Potter's own painting at the age of 12 in the left-hand corner pane of the Dalgeese column, which stands at Dalgeese House. And that was there for 10 years, between 1871 and 1881, that the house was rented by the family. And it's a fine place just off the road, and it's just above the River Tay, a spectacular spot. And of course, we can see why so many great Victorians went up there to shoot and to fish, and there were wonderful parties up there. And Beatrix spent a lot of her time up there painting and working with her menagerie of animals, and she seemed to come back with plenty of rabbits and all kinds of things from the trips up north. And she also had faithful dogs, and we've got pictures of her with her dogs. But of course, the main reason that her parents were there was really for was shooting and the social atmosphere. There's John Everett Millais and John Bright photographed by Rupert there. And there are photographs by Rupert Potter of great piles of game, and really quite you'd imagine that there wouldn't be a bird left in Perthshire when you look at some of his photographs. And I went the other day to Aberdeen Art Gallery to do some research, and there's a wonderful archive of photographs of Potter's photographs, and you can see a lot of what they got up to when they were in Scotland. And there is Beatrix, aged 10. And like all great artists, she kept a very good journal and a charming sketchbook. And you can see even at this early age, 1876, that she could paint very, very well, very neatly, and amusingly in places. She annotates these. John Everett Millais said of young Beatrice, he said, "Plenty of people can draw, but you have observation." What he meant by that is that she wasn't, it wasn't just a straightforward transcription of what she saw in front of her, but she really understood animals and the way they moved and their character. And Millais too, of course, in his own, here he is, his own painting called Orphans, which was painted in 1885. I don't know whether Beatrix Potter saw this, but it has the wonderful rabbit scooped up by the young girl. It's almost, you might think it would be very suitable to think of that almost as like a Beatrix Potter image. And these are examples of her pre-famous books, her work. She made these wonderful Christmas cards. Look at this one from 1890, Happy Christmas to You. And there we can see how she's dressed the rabbit beautifully, and it's painted so well. This pig went to market, this pig stayed at home, 1890. By this stage, an accomplished illustrator. Following in the tradition of John Tenniel, the great illustrator of Alice in Wonderland. And again, there's part of that in Beatrix's style. There's also the anthropomorphism as well is very much part of the Victorian era, and certainly Tenniel's work has that. This is rather lovely. This one, Our Dear Relations, which is a choir of cats and dogs singing. And, and these were beautifully reproduced as well. So these prefigure any of the books that you will know about. And of course, way back in 1828, Landseer had done Monkey Dandy from Monkiana, the men and miniature. And of course, we think of The Walrus and the Carpenter, John Tenniel, and Caldecott again, of course. There were many, many popular illustrations of animals and which illustrated human situations, particularly in advertisements as well. We have a lot of that going on in the 1870s and 1880s. And also the expanding ability to reproduce work in colour, which had hitherto not been possible, but by the 1870s it was now possible to reproduce in simple colour at scale. This is a nice one. This is the Rabbit's Christmas Party, 1892. So we're still not into the era of the books, but we can certainly see how her style was developing very, very well by this stage. And she was also known in her classroom, which to keep animals and observe them. And there's a little example from the Burnham Institute in the lower pane there of some of her illustrations of fungi, but also of animals as well. And she loved the natural world, and this she felt very comfortable with, and she was able to possibly illustrate some of her own loneliness as well in some of these illustrations. Notice the little rabbit peeping out from the corner of the window, looking out at the world, the snowy world outside. This is another one. This is Lady Rabbit and Gentleman passing on the street, and again another design for a Christmas card. She had this great affection and affinity. She was particularly good with rabbits, but she also was wonderful with dogs as well. And here's her with her wonderful border terrier here, and we can see this lovely photograph by her father of her with her a very patient dog there, and from 1897. But it was the illness to a relation, Noel Moore, which brought about the beginnings of something which was to lead to the little books. And she wanted to write a letter to cheer Noel up. And she was at the time, they'd finished living at Dalgise in the season, and they went to a house called Eastwood House, which is at Dunkeld, not far from Dunkeld Abbey, and it's on the banks of the River Tay, and that's a photograph of it as it is today. And so anyway, she made these wonderful illustrated letters, and as we can see in this letter is the first iteration of Flopsy, Mopsy and Cottontail rabbits. And you can see they're all beautifully drawn and beautifully observed too. They're not just generic. Every single twitch of the whisker is captured so beautifully. And she was also a good storyteller as well. And there we are. This is the early example of her markup for Peter Rabbit. And of course, that was one of her most famous characters. And she named after the successor to Benjamin Bouncer, and she named Peter Piper, and then Peter Rabbit was drawn completely freehand from every angle. She didn't use photography at all. This is what we mean about observation. She really was able to observe it and make these animals so believable and yet so beautifully illustrated. And there's Mr. McHenry chasing Peter Rabbit out of the vegetable patch. There's a charming illustration, that is. And here we are. Here's some more. But the early books were published through Frederick Warne and Company, and it was through Warne and Company that she met Norman Warne. And now Norman Warne, she was well into her 30s when she met Norman Warne, but the relationship, they had wanted to get married. Rupert disapproved very much of this liaison, and unfortunately they were going on a holiday to Wales when she learned of Norman Warne's tragic death at the age of 37. There's a picture of Norman Warne there. So he was involved in the company, and she never really lost her affection for Norman, although of course we look at her later marriage to Helis, but certainly she never lost this early love, this early disappointment in her life, and it kind of dominated some of her life in a way. That's why there is sometimes a little bit of melancholy about her work, and we can see it. But they were very successful publishers, were the Warne and Company, and we probably know a number of their other other publications as well, other authors that we've come across in our Victorian series. But parents very much disapproved, and also they disapproved of Bertram's choice as well, and being they were quite severe in many ways. It was although they had come really from a mill owning family and had really lived by inherited money, and obviously being a barrister later on, but it was certainly it was there was almost a sort of snobbery one gets, and Linda Lear's book really comes into detail about a lot of this. Norman Warren's grave is in fact can be found in Highgate Cemetery, and I've got a photograph of it there. For you to have a look at. But as the century turned into the 20th century, she spent time at Hilltop Time near Swarry in the Lake District, and the Lake District is an incredibly beautiful part of England, and it really was a place where it was a spiritual home for Beatrix. And there is it was there that she really developed her illustration style, and also the planting of the garden too, which forms the background of so many of the lovely little stories, and Esthwaite water, which features in so many of her wonderful illustrations, and such activity in them. And they're noted for their simplicity, their beauty, and their utility. Many people have recognised Beatrix Potter as a really supreme illustrator. And she was also a fine painter too. That's painted at Eastwick, and looking across the hills across to Esthwaite. And as you can see, she had this beautiful linear style filled in with watercolour, and it was a place where Rupert could continue his photographic work, and she could settle to painting, and she developed that. And of course, we can now visit these places, which have become incredibly popular with particularly tourists from the United States and Japan. And there's timed entry here now. It's so popular is this as a destination. But she was a fine painter, as you can see. This is a view across Esthwaite Water, and like so many Victorian artists, and people, it was part of your education that you could paint and transcribe the world in watercolor. And you can see that she really is a fine watercolorist, just as Bertram is as well. His painting of Esthwaite Water showed he was also a good artist. And she would work on the illustrations. They weren't just static things. This is an unfinished one where you can see the pie and the patty pan from 1902, where she started inking in, and she's obviously thought better of it and changed her mind about the position of the figure. So there are lots of these, and the wonderful thing is, if you go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, you can see many pages such as this, where she's really practiced what she's going to put. And why the books are so successful is that she's chosen just the right position for the illustration, and how these things look. And as you can see, these are inimitable examples of Beatrix's illustration from Taylor of Gloucester, both perhaps the highlight of her work, really. As I pointed out before, the Victoria and Albert Museum and the costume collection form a part of what goes on here. And she also went to the actual tailor's shop in Gloucester, and to get authentic background material. And in fact, they've appropriated now a shop just 2 or 3 places from where the Gloucester tailor's shop is, and there is a whole archive here in Gloucester now that you can look at, and somebody's actually made one of the waistcoat itself, which is a rather lovely tribute to Beatrix Potter. That's a photograph taken in Burnham of her when she's probably about 28 years old. And these again, she continued with these wonderful illustrated letters. This is the story of the Oakman from December 1916. They're lively letters, and it must have been lovely to receive these beautiful illustrated letters. Really beautiful. in so many ways. This is great. Here's Randolph Caldecott in the lower left-hand corner, his frog. But this is Taylor Jeremy Fisher, which is and the preparatory drawings. And this is one of her wonderful characters. And of course, in the 1960s, this was turned into a ballet as well in a little film, and it was wonderfully. It just shows the quality of Beatrix's visualization. Is almost like these are illustration boards for what was to come later, which you would never see, but they are wonderful things, and you can just almost hear those fish splashing out of the water behind Jeremy Fisher's back. Here's some of the lovely water lilies on Esthwaite, and a very frosted hills of Esthwaite. She was observing it all the time. There's no doubt about it. She took a great deal of time doing that. These are just studies of hedgehogs. She would have little cages to look at some of these animals and see and watch their behaviours. And you certainly can see that in so many of her works. And it's lovely sometimes when you look at some of her notebooks and early drafts in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It gives you such a good idea of how one might make these charming books. They're really pared down, and she's got just the right drawing and just the right amount of text. And that is why they're just so charming. She also, like so many Victorians, had a menagerie, and she went to Jamrach, who procured things for Rossetti. In fact, the wombats and the peacocks and all sorts of things that Rossetti had at Cheyne Walk were from the Jamrachs, and during her early years as well, she would go to Jamrachs to get some of these exotic animals as well. And that's a little picture of Jamrach's aviary up in the left-hand corner. You can see with this wonderful early illustration to Jemima Puddle Duck that she really is quite loose in her approach to give the duck some real vitality. She's really gone in hard on trying to illustrate it in such a way that it will really work. There's nothing photographic about it. It's a real sensitive study of the way a way an animal might or a bird might be, and she's worked out how to put a bonnet upon it and make that look convincing, and that's all part of her great skill. Anyway, happily for Beatrix, but not necessarily for her parents, Beatrix finally met the solicitor William Heelis when she was in the Lake District, and they were married in 1913. She was 47 years old when she was married, so obviously too late for children. But from all we gather, it was a happy and a long marriage. Many of them sharing similar views about nature, and certainly their love of the Lake District and their love of Herdwick sheep, of course, really brought them ever so close together. And although she never forgot Norman Warne, she was pleased that this flowering of love in her middle age was something a real joy to her, and from all we would understand, that there were 30 happy years of marriage. This is in Gloucester. This is the reproduction of the room in which celebrates the Taylor of Gloucester, and you can see here lots of where I'm getting a lot of the information for the illustrations and some of the smaller studies and little facts about her life. And obviously they translate so well into these little dolls and these figurine and just the general paraphernalia that is in the background of a Beatrix Potter painting. Here is her palette, her watercolour palette, which is preserved at the Burnham Institute. And there's an early study for Peter Rabbit, drawn in pen and pencil. And delightful as it is, you can see that she has such a fine touch. And here's Hilltop Farmhouse near Swarry. And she used the house as a studio following her marriage. Of course, she moved down to Eastwick and lived at near Swarry, but this is open to the public. The gardens were also, part of her joy there was gardening and a natural sort of new plan, really, for gardening. And Gertrude Jekyll, the garden designer and arts and crafts theorist, helped inspire Potter in her work. That's a painting by William Nicholson of Gertrude Jekyll. And so the influence of the arts and crafts is upon the garden as well. And I know we've looked at part of that in some of our talks and touched upon these things. But certainly, they've tried to preserve everything as near as they possibly can, bearing in mind that thousands of people pass through here every year. And it does make it difficult keeping the farmhouse anything like it was with Beatrix Potter, when you've got people tramping through it at coach parties, disgorging people on almost every hour. And here's a lovely painting by Bertram Potter, painted in the Edwardian era, of landscape with sheep. And of course, sheep were to become a big part of Beatrix Potter's later life. And that's a wonderful study of a ram's head painted in 1895. And such studies are, of course, I mean, when William Heelis saw things like that, he knew that he also was very fond of Herdwick's sheep. And really, later on in life, after the series of books had finished, she threw herself into the breeding of Herdwick sheep. And here she is in later life, at a sheepdog trial and a show of Herdwick sheep. And she took great interest in this, and also her beloved Lake District. And she had made considerable money from the sale of these books, enough to preserve the farmhouses and many acres of land of the Lake District for the National Trust, of which we're really grateful, because it has helped the National Trust keep these farmlands and these the sheep herds and everything like that on the fells the way they should be. So Beatrix Potter died at the age of 77. She had lived a full and wonderful life, and her best legacy possibly is not just the books, but it is the Herdwick sheep, and also, as William Wordsworth has said about the Lake District, is the loveliest spot that man hath ever found. I would concur with that view myself. Spending many happy times and holidays in my youth up in the Lake District, and enjoying the scenery up there. It really is second to none. And we can see how it deeply influenced Beatrix Potter, and how her legacy comes not only in her illustrations, but in all that she's given to Britain through her wonderful and generous legacy of to the National Trust. So this is just to remind you that these inimitable illustrations are really so important to so many people's childhood. And I'm really thankful that to all the people who have contributed to some of my photographs. And I wondered last year, when I started preparing talks on Beatrix Potter, that whether I could find quite the right photographs. But it's been absolutely fascinating researching her work and seeing that she's far more than just a children's book illustrator.